All right, so today we're diving into something a little unexpected.
Ooh,
We're talking The Sims.
interesting.
I know you're interested in this idea of, how institutions get shaped by all these different societal forces. And well,
Yeah.
believe it or not, The Sims actually gives us a pretty unique way to look at that.
Hmm.
So get ready to see The Sims in a whole new light. You might even end up questioning some assumptions about the world around us.
I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, it's fascinating how The Sims, even though on the surface it seems pretty lighthearted,
Yeah.
can actually reflect real-world dynamics,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to things like gender roles, relationships, and even economics.
Hmm. That's interesting. I mean, it is more than just a game at this point. It's like a cultural phenomenon, right?
Exactly.
And the fact that it's so popular, particularly with women, that's something we should definitely explore.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. The game lets you create these simulated lives. You can build homes, nurture relationships, chase careers, you name it. And it's amazing the level of control you have over every tiny detail.
Yeah.
It's incredibly appealing, especially when real life can feel so overwhelming sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I can definitely see that. That control, that ability to shape a virtual world to be exactly how you want it, that really resonates with people, especially those who might feel like they are kind of constrained by societal expectations in their real lives.
Absolutely. And here's where things get really interesting. When you look at how people actually play The Sims, you see this pattern emerge. Often, women in the game end up in these more domestic roles,
Mm.
the caregivers, the homemakers,
Right.
while men are often depicted as the primary breadwinners.
Interesting.
So the question is this just mirroring what we see in society, or is there something more deliberate going on here, like a design choice by the game creators?
That's the million-dollar question. It's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. I mean, the game's a product of its time, right? So it naturally reflects the norms and expectations that were prevalent when it was created. But at the same time, the mechanics of the game itself, how tasks are assigned and rewarded, that definitely plays a role too.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, for example, in the earlier versions of the game, skills like cooking and cleaning,
Mm,
those were more often associated with female Sims,
right.
while things like logic and handiness, those were more common among male Sims.
So are we saying that The Sims is reinforcing these traditional gender roles? Or is it actually giving players a way to break free from them? It's almost like this virtual sandbox where those expectations are both present and potentially, subvertible.
Yeah, that's the paradox, isn't it? The game sets up a framework, but within that framework, you have room to experiment. Like, take the Open for Business expansion pack, for instance. It let players create and run their own businesses. So suddenly you have this path for Sims of any gender to be successful financially outside of those traditional career paths.
That's a great point. And that kind of leads us to another fascinating aspect of The Sims, relationships. Studies have shown that women playing The Sims often create these idealized male characters.
Hmm.
Guys who are sensitive, attentive, supportive. Qualities that might be totally different from what they're experiencing in their real-life relationships.
That is interesting.
It makes you wonder, why is that?
Yeah, it's a really curious phenomenon. Maybe it's just a longing for those specific qualities, qualities that women might feel are missing in their real-world relationships. It really makes you think, what does this say about the desires and maybe even frustrations that women are experiencing in their romantic lives?
Is it about seeking a sense of control? Or maybe it's a way of exploring different relationship dynamics, but in this safe virtual space.
Could be.
It definitely gives you something to think about.
It does. And, it all ties back to this broader idea of how virtual worlds let us experiment with different identities and explore desires that might be, suppressed or considered unacceptable in the real world.
Right.
It's a form of wish fulfillment, in a way to test boundaries and maybe even challenge those societal norms, at least within the context of the game.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it makes me think about how
So welcome back to our deep dive into The Sims.
it's wild to think about how this game, something that seems so lighthearted,
Yeah.
can actually tell us so much about the things we want, the things that frustrate us, and maybe even about those hidden societal rules we all kind of follow. We were talking earlier about this whole idea of creating these perfect partners in The Sims.
Right.
And it makes me wonder if that desire for control, that need to
Yeah.
make things just right, if that extends to other parts of the game too. What about the economic system?
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on with that. Let's talk about simoleons for a minute, the in-game currency.
Right.
It's definitely a simplified economic system, no doubt about that. But the way it kind of mirrors and at the same time distorts real-world economics, I think that's incredibly revealing.
Yeah, it's almost like a super fun crash course in personal finance.
Huh.
You learn about budgeting, why working hard matters. You see how investments can pay off. But then it kind of skips over all the complicated stuff, like inflation, the ups and downs of the market, and, those systemic inequalities that really impact people's financial lives in the real world.
You're exactly right. It simplifies things, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me wonder, what kind of impact does this simplified system have on players, especially younger players who are just starting to understand how the world works?
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm.
Could it give them a skewed perspective on money? Like make them think it's easier to get rich than it actually is? Or downplay how tough it can be to manage your money in the real world?
Absolutely. There's definitely potential for a disconnect there.
Yeah.
The game makes it seem so straightforward. Get a job, improve your skills, sell some paintings, but it doesn't really show you the whole picture,
Yeah.
the nuances of economic mobility or those systemic barriers that make it harder for some people to get ahead financially.
So in a way, are we saying The Sims is promoting this kind of unrealistic view of financial success?
It's possible.
But at the same time, you could also argue that it's laying the foundation, right? It helps people understand basic economic concepts, and it does it in a way that's fun and engaging.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
For sure.
And, this idea of a double-edged sword applies to something else in The Sims. This illusion of freedom that you have within this very structured environment.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. The Sims gives you all these choices, right? Careers, relationships, how you want to live your life. But you're always playing within the rules of the game. Your Sims have needs that have to be met. There are rules to follow. And actions have consequences.
That does sound familiar.
It's like a parallel to real life, isn't it?
Totally. We all like to think we have unlimited choices. But the reality is there are always constraints, societal norms, financial limitations,
Exactly.
cultural expectations.
All of that shapes the choices we make.
So are you saying that The Sims lets you explore those limitations?
In a way, yeah.
But in a safe space,
Right.
like a controlled environment.
Exactly. You can push the boundaries, see how far you can go. You can test the limits of the system, observe what happens, but without any real-world consequences.
Like a virtual social experiment.
Precisely.
You can try out different lifestyles, see how different choices play out,
Yeah.
maybe even gain a deeper understanding of those forces that are shaping our lives, both in the game and in the real world.
And it connects back to what we were talking about earlier, those idealized male Sims, the ones who embody qualities that might be missing in real-world relationships.
Right.
Maybe this virtual experimentation. It's a way for players to process those desires,
Interesting.
to figure out what truly matters in a partner,
Yeah.
and maybe even to challenge those traditional relationship dynamics.
It's like a safe space to explore different relationship models, right?
Just that.
To experiment with different approaches and see how those choices impact their Sims' happiness and fulfillment.
And perhaps even gain insights that they can apply to their real-life relationships.
That's a really cool way to think about it.
It is. And speaking of change and evolution, we can't forget how The Sims itself has been shaped by real-world trends and societal shifts. The game hasn't just stayed the same. It's constantly evolving, adapting to changing cultural norms, new technologies, and what the players want.
Absolutely. It's become way more inclusive over time. We've seen the introduction of same-sex relationships, the expansion of career options, and more customization when it comes to gender expression and identity.
And these changes, they're not happening in isolation. They reflect a growing awareness of diversity and a demand for better representation.
Absolutely.
It really shows how players can influence the games they love and how virtual worlds can reflect and even contribute to social change.
It's a good reminder that even in a game like The Sims, something that seems like pure escapism, we're still engaging with ideas and concepts that have real-world consequences.
For sure.
And that interplay between the virtual and the real, that's what makes The Sims so fascinating to analyze.
I couldn't agree more. It's not just about entertainment. It's about exploring those connections between our virtual lives and those bigger social structures, the ones that shape our world.
Okay, so I know our listeners are probably waiting for that book recommendation we mentioned, but before we get to that, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how gender roles are portrayed in The Sims. We talked about how women often end up taking on those more domestic roles, while men are often the primary breadwinners. Is that really just a reflection of societal norms, or is there something more nuanced going on?
Yeah, it's a question that's caused a lot of debate, and for good reason, I think. I mean, it's easy to see it as just a straight-up reflection of traditional gender roles, especially in those earlier versions of the game. Like you said, certain tasks and skills were definitely presented in a gendered way, and the career paths that were available, they seem to reinforce those stereotypes too.
But, and this is what I find so interesting, The Sims doesn't force you to follow those paths. You can totally break the mold. You could have a female Sim who's like a brilliant surgeon
Right.
while her male partner stays home with the kids and like pursues his passion for painting.
Exactly. And that's what's so crucial, that ability to go against what's expected. It's what turns The Sims into this really cool sandbox for exploring gender roles and challenging those societal norms. You can literally play out different scenarios and see how it affects your Sims' lives.
Yeah, it's almost like a social experiment, isn't it?
It is.
You can test those boundaries, see if a female Sim who's focused on her career actually feels fulfilled, or if a male Sim who chooses to be a stay-at-home dad, you know, faces any kind of backlash in the game.
It's such a unique opportunity to engage with these questions, but in a low-stakes setting, you
Yeah.
know? And that kind of experimentation can be really powerful,
Yeah,
especially for people who might feel limited by those traditional gender roles in their own lives.
totally. It's like a safe space to challenge those ideas that we've all kind of grown up with,
Yeah.
to flip the script and see what happens, and maybe even discover some new possibilities for themselves along the way.
And you know, it's important to remember that The Sims itself has evolved as our conversations about gender have evolved. Later expansions and updates, they brought in same-sex relationships, they expanded the career options, and they even allowed for more customization when it comes to how Sims express their gender.
Yeah, those changes definitely reflect a growing awareness of diversity and a push for more inclusive representation.
Yeah.
It shows how a game like The Sims can both mirror and shape how we think about gender dynamics.
It's that dynamic between the virtual and the real. That's what makes The Sims so interesting to analyze.
Absolutely. All right, so before we move on to that book recommendation, I want to touch on something we've been kind of dancing around this whole time. The psychological impact of The Sims, particularly on women.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect to consider. The game gives players this incredible amount of control over their Sims' lives, how they look, their personalities, their relationships, their careers, everything. And that kind of control, that godlike power, it can have a big impact psychologically.
Yeah, on the one hand, it can be super empowering, right?
Totally.
It gives players a sense of agency and control that they might not have in their real lives. It's a chance to create this world exactly how they want it.
But like we've been talking about, there's always another side to the coin. That level of control can also create a sense of detachment from the real world. The Sims offers this perfect little world, where problems are easy to solve and happiness is always within reach.
Yeah, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing, I guess. It can
Yeah.
be a nice escape from the stress of everyday life,
For sure.
but it could also lead to unrealistic expectations, or even make it hard to separate the virtual world from the real one.
Exactly. And that brings us to the book we want to recommend. If you're interested in learning more about these psychological nuances, how these simulated worlds can affect our perceptions and behaviors, and what The Sims can teach us about gender, relationships, and identity, then we highly recommend checking out Sims and Society, a deep dive into the game that changed how we play.
It's available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. It's a really thought-provoking book.
It
It
is.
goes into those often overlooked aspects of The Sims.
Mm-hmm.
It examines the cultural significance, the psychological impact, and how the game can both reflect and shape our understanding of the world around us.
It's the perfect companion to our deep dive today.
Well, folks, that brings our exploration of The Sims to an end. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We talked about the game mechanics, its impact on culture, and even its potential to influence how we view gender, relationships, and the world as a whole.
We asked some tough questions, challenged some assumptions. Hopefully, we've given you a better understanding of this seemingly simple game and its surprising complexity.
Absolutely. Remember, the world is full of these hidden structures, these invisible forces that shape our lives in ways we don't even realize. But by becoming aware of them, by questioning the things we take for granted, we can start to take back control and create a world that's more just, equitable, and fulfilling for everyone.
That's the power of a deep dive, isn't it? It's not just about gaining knowledge, it's about using that knowledge to change ourselves and the world around us.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. Until next time.